Hey, what's going on, everybody? Today I'm going to try to create a research project from scratch. Periodically during office hours when things are slow, or during our 1 to 2:15 p.m. Sessions, I will be occasionally trying to work on this project and make it happen. You'll notice that my webcam is not currently up. That's only because I actually am concurrently holding office hours. I'll be pausing this stream whenever somebody comes into the chat, obviously, so that I can work on their projects. But for now, since I've got some time, I just wanted to sort of start working on this research project. And so you can see that this is actually like a really basic outline that I've created that's going to help me get through up to composition 4. So this is going to be my attempt to sort of speed run through the first half of the course so I can get up to speed with the projects that y'all are working on. You can see here that I've got my introduction fairly well planned out already. This is something I did via our 1 to 2:15 discussion on Tuesday. I put this together. You can see I've already got a topic here. Last time I was really struggling with this topic. It was really difficult to think about because I'm trying to work on partisan reactions to public health crises in general. I'm trying to think about how to take sort of my initial background and turn it into something more generalizable, right? Generalizability being a pretty important concept we've talked about in the course so far. And so I came to this, first of all, thinking about COVID-19. Obviously, it's on everybody's minds. It's on my mind. It screwed up my whole semester, definitely. Hopefully it's not screwing up y'all's semester too much. But I was thinking about this, and I was thinking about it from the perspective of a political science kind of research question. And really the first thing that I saw online that was super interesting in this perspective was this really cool graphic. Maybe I can actually bring it up here in a second. Let's see if I can do that. Let's see, where did I first see this graphic? I can maybe even just, I think it was in this Vox article. Yeah, here we go. I saw this. Actually, it turns out that this is a thing that was created by a guy I know from Tufts University named Brian Schaffner. He did this really cool graphic, and it turns out that New York Times took it and made it a little prettier. But basically what this is showing is the over time correlation between how often a certain media market searched for hand sanitizer on Google, which is kind of crazy, and then what their Trump share of the 2016 vote was. So places that were like 80% pro-Trump versus places that were like 20% pro-Trump. In that sense, they would be like 80% pro-Clinton. And you can see that in early March, basically, the really pro-Trump places were basically like searching for hand sanitizer about the same amount as they were before the outbreak, right? Like there's pretty much no discernible difference between this group. Like look at this like square and like this square, right? They're not really different. But the sort of like more pro-Clinton places were like going nuts searching for hand sanitizer in March 1st through 12th. And then later, essentially this square, like these people moved up into the average. So they started to take it seriously. And that's particularly because of cue taking, basically. What happened when Trump declared a state of emergency, this actually cued these partisans to sort of move up in terms of their search. So, this is not the best, most perfect analysis here. It's certainly using a pretty sort of a blunt tool to measure concern. Google searches for hand sanitizer. But it does show this really interesting pattern. And I think it's a really clear piece of evidence for partisan cue taking. And so it made me think, right? This is kind of the beginning of any good Poly 301 research project. It made me think about what's going on here. Right, why is this happening? Is this something that's generalizable that I want to do a study on this kind of relationship? And so I basically typed in my background. I said, oh, look, there's a bunch of partisan cue-taking responses to the crisis out there. But how can I turn this into a Poly 301 approved research topic? The way to do that is to broaden. And so I broadened this out to think about partisan reactions writ large to public health crises. And so I then thought about some of these other possible health crises that we've been thinking about over the past few decades, right? SARS, something that I was definitely around for. Mad cow disease actually was a huge deal. And a lot of you might not remember this, but in Europe especially, there was a really, really, really massive reaction to mad cow. And actually, much of my family lives in Europe. I have family in Switzerland. And like to this day, they're really weird about eating beef as a result of the mad cow scare of a couple decades ago. And so I was thinking to myself, look at all these different possible kinds of sort of SARS, swine flu, all these things, if we can generalize this, maybe let's think about how partisans react to public health crises in general. Now, this also, as I was doing this, and again, this is just kind of our getting caught up to speed live stream before I start really working on this project again, this also presented me with another sort of curveball. Because I was interested in Americans. Obviously, I'm American. This is the research population that I care about. But I was really having a hard time framing this because I didn't want to make it this same picture, right? This is interesting, right? We can see that Trump's share of the vote is having this effect. And so when I go back to try to figure out my IV and my DV in this kind of relationship, if there's a relationship I want to look at, the first thing that I wrote here was essentially just partisanship. And so I was interested in whether or not partisanship affected concern over public health crises, but really that's super underspecified. That's not actually what we want, because if we go down, this is part of why research design is building the airplane while it's in the air, and a little bit of why it's very difficult to do this without a lot of experience quickly. And so I came down and I immediately started to preview my formal hypothesis statement. And I said, well, if I can manage to find good measures of these concepts, if I can get close to knowing about this, maybe I can devise a basic hypothesis. And so I was thinking about this in a comparison of Americans. I hypothesize, gosh, typing on live stream is hard, that an increase in, and this is where I got a little confused, partisanship is associated with a decrease in concern for public health crises, right? And all of a sudden we realize that this is a wonky hypothesis. Okay, not good. Bad, not good hypothesis. Now, why is that? Because what does this mean, an increase in partisanship? This isn't really the concept that I'm interested in, right? This isn't close to this, right? This isn't close to my initial the thought process. Because what this is a partisan divide, but it's a directional partisan divide. It's like saying Trump's share has an effect here before the Q taking happens, right? I don't want to do that. I want to know about an increase, why is this particular pattern happening? That's what I care about. Why is this particular pattern happening? And so what I'm willing to bet, and again, this is where, building the airplane in while it's flying, I'm immediately thinking about my theory, about my sort of basic expectations, the kind of stuff that you wrote about in Composition 1, thinking all the way back to the beginning of the semester. I was thinking about these expectations, and I think my hunch here, and the reason why this is interesting to me, is that it's not about Trump voters, not about specifically Trump voters doing X or Y, even though we could probably devise some kind of stereotypic set of assumptions about Trump voters, which are probably not going to hold up in a social scientific inquiry, right? My bigger question was, what about these Trump voters in 2020? That are causing them to follow the president's cues so closely. It made me think a little bit about a couple of things, right? What we know about motivated reasoning. This is a theory that is going to go into my theory section, certainly, right? This is kind of why statement. Preview upcoming attractions. Motivated reasoning theory. And I'm also going to be talking about incumbency effects. So essentially this idea being that it's the incumbency of the president that's allowing this cue taking to happen in any scenario. And so this is just a really extreme example of a broader phenomenon that I'm interested in, which is, can a president signal to their loyal followers essentially to not care and then all of a sudden to care? And so instead of it being just partisans that I care about, I actually am interested in instead co-partisans, right? Partisans who share their partisanship with the incumbent president. That's really the phenomenon I care about. If the president says something, regardless of who the president is, do their followers essentially jump in line as soon as they say the word. That's what I care about. That's the cue-taking relationship that I'm interested in. And so if the DV here is concern over public health crisis, my expectations are already really framed by what I already know about some of these partisan kind of things. Right? This is the kind of like set of like potential mistakes that a lot of people will run into in their 301 project, and they'll have to sort of get all the way down here until they realize why it doesn't work. Because all of a sudden we can write this formal hypothesis statement, again, with directionality. In comparison of Americans, I hypothesize that co-partisans of the incumbent president, in this current case it would be Republicans because Trump is a Republican president, co-partisans of the incumbent president will exhibit, here we go, we can get an increase or a decrease statement, right? A decrease in concern over public health crises relative to members of the out party. Okay, so the out party essentially just a stand-in term for people who do not share the partisanship of the president. So in this case, currently it's Democrats. And so the idea, so this is also something that's not just related to cue taking, right? Not just if the president says something, I will believe them. It's more about the incumbent president's reputation. The idea being, and we'll get into this later, that members of the party for which the president is sharing their partisanship, those people are going to be more inclined to like laugh off basically like really serious problems that are happening during that administration because they look bad for the president. And so that's like a common phenomenon that we see in the economy, for example, like during the economic recovery of kind of 2009 through, I guess, like March 2020, basically, this long sort of economic recovery, we saw that anytime you were a member of the same party as the president, regardless of what time it was, you generally thought the economy was doing better than if you were a member of the out party. And so since this is something I study, I'm especially interested in whether or not this kind of like relates to public health crises. That's something I know a lot less about. I'm not a scholar of public health, but I think that partisanship matters here. And so again, it's not just partisanship. We need to be careful with this. I think my independent variable concept, right? These, by the way, these aren't IV and DV. These are IV concept and DV concept. This is really co-partisanship with the current president. Okay, so I've set up this introduction. This is kind of my outline here. We're going to be writing it in real time later, but we can see that this leads ultimately to this well-defined research question. Among Americans, does co-partisanship with the incumbent presidential administration affect levels of concern over public health crises? I don't have a direction input here yet in the RQ. That comes later in the hypothesis. We've got to go through the whole theory section to be able to get to this point. But I'm putting that out here. I'm kind of putting a thumbtack in this thing just to be able to state, right, I think this is going to be meaningful later. Okay. So the next thing I wanted to do was sort of briefly start outlining the lit review. And this is where most of my time and attention went in this early session that I did last time. By the way, this only took me about 20 minutes last time I did it, so it's pretty. I did it pretty fast. I told you this was going to be a speed run, and a speed run indeed it is. So, okay, we've got the lit review, we got bucket one. Essentially, I said to myself, look, I've got a few ways that I can split this literature up that I don't know much about. I'm going to be reading it in real time. I do know, though, what the golden bucket is, right? And that is this idea that partisan misperceptions, partisan sort of motivated reasoning drives reactions to public health. That is the literature. I know already, I've seen a little bit of this out there. I know some people who do research on it. I've met them. I've read their papers. I've reviewed their papers, some of them. I know some of this stuff is out there. And actually, the first thing that actually started with the golden bucket here, because I knew of that literature, and it brought me to kind of this page that I started kind of pasting just like garbagey, like not actually in good format bibliographic information into. I'm going to format those bibliographic citations later once I decide that I want to use them in the study. Because otherwise it's like such a waste of time to like carefully like turn these things into Chicago style. I'm just going to make sure I've got this stuff so I can search for it later. And so my golden bucket here is about partisanship. This one, this Gallus et al. Paper, I hadn't seen this before. I had just Google Scholar search for this one, but Brader and Tucker in the comparative politics literature, I'd found this one before. I cite this a lot in my research. This Hart and Nisbet I hadn't really seen before. And then the Claridita and the Kim, Dion, and Platis article. This is a really, I think, important article for the for my study, right? Ebola, Elections, and Immigration in the journal Politics, Groups, and Identities. I can put it, italicize this just so that you are able to see that's a journal. I know that's a journal, but you might not. Bucket 1, though, this is something that actually I thought this was a mistake I made. I thought this was going to end up being stuff that goes in my golden bucket because I know this guy, Matt Mata. He's a nice guy. I've met Dan Can before. Letitia Bodie and Vraga. This is an article that I cite a lot. And so I kind of started, actually the first thing I did was I brought up Matt Mata's website. So Matt Mata, Oklahoma State. Again, these are the built-in like advantages. This is like watching somebody play a video game that like they're super good at. They've got like thousands of hours in, and you're like, wait, hang on, why did you do what you did? And it's really just because like we've got more experience building the airplane while it's flying, right? In our case, maybe we can build the airplane on the ground because we don't need to launch it the way that you have already in the beginning of the semester. Anyway, this guy's a nice guy, really smart. He's currently at Oklahoma State University. I think he's been there just started this year maybe. He was doing a couple of really great postdocs. Basically, he's worked all over the place, doing really cool stuff. Shout out to Matt Mata. Hopefully he's around. Maybe he'll come to this chat one day. But you can see that if you go to his professional website, here he is on TV. I can go over to his publications or his current research page or I guess publications, and you can see some of this stuff. There are a couple of these papers that I've seen before, right? Like this one, the Trujillo. This came out like yesterday. I like just saw this kind of drop. It's a really great article. Psychological risk factors and communication strategies. Let's see, but the ones that I thought were most effective here were seismic risk. This is about earthquakes. So Matt studies, and Tim Callahan and a few of his other co-authors, Stephen Sylvester, really interested in like misperceptions related to like health and scientific risk stuff. So like you'll see a lot of these articles like in journals like Health Communication. So this is one that I think I've got on there: how localized outbreaks and changes in media coverage affect Zika attitudes. And so this is exactly what I'm looking for. This is stuff that's very related to my topic, but I thought that he had more of a partisanship angle here. And I know that, you know, once we get into these papers, start to read them a little bit more carefully, because it's been a while since I've seen this stuff. Right, this is actually one of the reasons why we got in contact in the first place, because he was doing stuff on the Dunning-Kruger effect. But anyway, all this to say that I thought that we would see more partisanship in these articles, but it really turns out that this is actually a different bucket altogether, right? This localized outbreaks paper, this is actually about media coverage, right? And so I looked at that. I looked at this. Dominic Stecula is a really interesting person as well, doing really great work. But ultimately, it caused me to reorient my bucket setup. And I said, you know, bucket 1, like the things that I initially thought of, like immediately off the bat, like Matt's work, actually falls into a different bucket, which is about media use and whether or not coverage of crises and public health issues drives concern, basically. Because again, that's my DV. That's what I care about, right? For all buckets, I want to answer the question: what does the literature say influences concern, right? DV equals concern towards public health crises, basically. Who brushes this off as not important? Who takes it super seriously? And so that's what I want to answer. And so these articles say, look, it's how the media present it. That's what makes it, that's what causes people to vary in terms of whether they're concerned, right? We can remember here, TV variation goes like this. Nah, man, this thing is overblown versus OMG crisis mode. Activate. So like that's variation in the DV. That's what we care about, right? And so these articles, bucket 1, are making the case, right? Oh man, this stuff matters. Bucket 2, I kind of just started working on this bucket, and we'll get into this in just a moment. I started working on this AIDS education programs, food safety education. I sort of was spitballing like this other idea that I know at least a little bit about. Like, yeah, maybe if we like have official government programs to educate citizens about the like real risks of some of these things, maybe that could have an effect on public outcomes as well. So like we've got media, we've got public prevention education, right? And then the third bucket I've got here, you know, there might be other sources of variation, but it seems to me, based on my intuitions, that these are probably the two big pieces here in terms of what actually causes people to say OMG crisis mode activate, right? And I know some of you are probably thinking about like, what about like if your family member tells you something? What about if you have like a nurse who works in your house or like lives in your or is a member of your family? Absolutely, I'm sure that those things have a major effect, but those things are a little bit more like particularistic, like a lot less like they're very particular, because it's like things that probably only apply to like small groups in the population and are therefore less like studied probably as like major. Continue my office hours here while I work. Those things, right? Like I have a bucket here. This is, you don't want a bucket like this, right? Weird stuff that only applies to like 7 people in your data set, right? That's not going to be super compelling to anyone, you know. Like I could think about, there's probably, you know, maybe there's literature out there that's like whether your spouse serves in the National Guard at least 3x per month, right? Like, yeah, I mean, there's more than 7 people out there for whom that's true. I know at least one person for whom that's true. But again, like there's probably not a lot of literature out there on that, because it's like describing the practice and behavior of like a really like sort of circumscribed group. And so the buckets here, like these are big major drivers. I think that these are pretty important drivers. Media use, prevention education, and then my golden bucket, I'm going to have a lit review that really sort of has two big buckets and then the golden bucket. And then finally the gap statement. So I'm going to sort of try to organize this literature review like that. I don't really know why I put this up here, but I think it's a useful reminder. Anyways, that's kind of the original planning of my lit review. Media use, bucket 2, I can maybe take bucket 3 out of here, unless in the reading the literature I really stumble across a subset of that literature that tells me something really meaningful, like a third factor that's super important. Public health education initiatives, and then the golden bucket being the partisan misperceptions and reactions. Okay. The theory, if I were to try to outline this, I was saying this preview of coming attractions, right? Why do I think this is happening? Well, I think that, and this is something that's really important for your like composition 4 theory statements. A why statement might say something like, co-partisanship with the incumbent president is expected to diminish concern over public health crises because, and I'm going to bold and underline because, right? Now, why is that? Well, this is, again, something that we need to think carefully about. And already, as I'm typing it out, I'm starting to realize that there are some counter arguments that could be out there, right? Where you might say, not always. Like this isn't a one-to-one relationship. Why, there might be some cases where the incumbent president, for example, makes a really, really big deal about a public health crisis. It takes like extreme sort of like strong leadership on like talking about how severe and problematic it is, and they're able to cue their co-partisans more than others, right? But I would say that in sort of like a default state, that without that really strong cue, again, this is going back to Brian Schaffner's paper, right? Like in the default world, this isn't a paper, by the way, this is just a graph. But in the default world, it's this, right? This is the post-Q world. This is the pre-Q world. And so I think in this case, right, this is where I would expect us to be before anyone takes action. Where out partisans are like, dang, this is crazy. And then in partisans are like, no, it's fine. I'm going to wait for the president to make a statement. The president told me it was okay, therefore it's okay. And so the theory, right, I would say in the absence of cues, so I'm going to actually qualify my theory a little bit, of strong cueing effects, co-partisanship with the incumbent president is expected to diminish concern over public health crises because, and here's where we fill that in, try to think about how to articulate that, because co-partisans will be motivated to view reality positively, to preserve their so I'm actually going to use some specialized terminology to describe this. So the partisan preferred world state is a specialized term that you might come across in the literature sometimes. That's essentially what co-partisans with the president want to live in. Oh, what happened here? What they want to live in all the time. So it's the view of the world in which the co-partisan is we could say more competent, successful, capable, and better at preserving the positive state of the world than others. That's maybe just a baseline kind of definition of that. And of course, I probably want to go back to some of the literature on that. I can think of a couple papers that have a good definition of the partisan preferred world state that I might otherwise want to throw in there. But for now, we can just go with this partisan preferred world state definition. The view of the world in which the co-partisan is more competent, successful, capable, and better at preserving the positive state of the world than others. And so what this causes partisans to assume that real, right, this is the key point of motivated reasoning, objective conditions in reality are better than they might actually be, so long as the co-partisan is in charge. I'll put an exclamation point, several exclamation points, because that's pretty crazy, right? It's a crazy sort of theoretical assumption, but something that we in the political science literature are always talking about. This idea that, like, if I'm a co-partisan, and again, it doesn't matter which party, right? I think that's one thing we need to get rid of, is this assumption that it's like, oh, it's just Republicans that are doing this today because of Trump, right? Any partisan can do this. Partisans across the world, actually, we've seen this happening in any number of partisan circumstances. They've basically, these partisans basically say, I think the world is good because my guy's in charge, or girl, right? I think the world is good because of that. So it's an assumption. And so you can imagine how that partisan preferred world state would go into this why statement, because it also might affect, and this is where my intuition, where my hunch comes in, In a Q-free world where the president hasn't basically tried to own the crisis and take leadership over it yet, we'll see that the co-partisans will downplay the severity of the crisis, because they'll say, oh, no, things are good because the president that I like is in charge. Whereas the out party relative to the in party, remember, we're always making a comparison anytime we're doing this kind of a study, an implicit comparison. The out partisans are like, the world's on fire, everything's falling apart, and implicitly they're also saying it's because we are doing the opposite, right? Our preferred world state discounts the skills and the competency of the person in charge, right? So the corollary, this is the view of the world also a view of the world in which the out partisan is less competent, successful, etc., and it causing out partisans to assume objective conditions in reality are worse than they might actually be, so long as the out party is in charge. So that's like a really, again, a huge statement. And so these two things together, if we were to make, put those in like a box or something, right? Maybe I will do that. Insert text box. Simple text box. Grab the reader's attention. I'd like to not grab the reader's attention by breaking up this text, though. Whoa. Microsoft Word is so stupid. Why does it do this? Just justify my text box. There we go. So we got our theory, we've got our little text box that kind of put off to the side here. The partisan preferred world state is that, right? But my why statement is what I care about. Or whatever. All right. In the absence of strong queuing effects, co-partisanship with the incumbent president is expected to diminish concern of public health crises because co-partisans will be motivated to view reality more positively to preserve their partisan preferred world state. More positively than out partisans. We go edit that a little bit. And so, of course, then I want to describe, right? I want to take some time really describing, introducing the partisan preferred world state, talking about why this matters, how this works. I probably want to cite some of the existing literature on how this affects people's real perceptions of objective conditions. Note that, however, this stuff, like when I'm citing that, I will eventually be citing, right, some pretty important political science work, right? E.g. scholarship on motivated reasoning. So maybe like Dan Kahan's work, we could say. I can think of at least one article. Let me guess, what was that? 2017 maybe? I'll have to go back and check that site, but I'm not really sure. But for example, like Dan Kahan's work, this is stuff, right? This is a piece of literature. This is an article, actually a book chapter, that is not appearing in my lit review. OMG. It's not appearing in my lit review, but it's going to appear later because it's going to support my theory that relies on this idea of the partisan preferred world state. And so that's one, I think, really important lesson for all of these papers, is that like your lit review is going to review a bunch of literature, but your theory might introduce new pieces of literature that you didn't review, because Dan Kahan does not care about my DV. His article has nothing to do with concern over public health crises. It has everything to do with the overall idea of motivated reasoning. My cat, by the way, is agreeing with me. She's meowing. In agreement, having also read that article. But so, again, my theory statement, I've already kind of fleshed this out a little bit, and then I've kind of come down and I've already done my formal hypothesis statement. if I wanted to do possible confounder, this is one really interesting thing that I haven't really puzzled through at all yet, so I'm going to try to do it in real time. This question of like, what else could be driving this, right? I think one possible confounder that we've already talked about is the Q from the president, right? Like, if there's a Q, this changes everything. I mean, we already saw this with this, right? This is the world in which there's a Q, where Trump is like, hey, take this seriously. Boom. All of a sudden, that relationship is almost zero. Right? The correlation, the R coefficient, Pearson's product moment correlation coefficient, here is like really small. Here, it's enormous. This has got to be a really, really strong correlation. Here, it's almost nothing. And so that is a really big difference. Already, we've got two views of the world. We've got some expectation that if there's a Q, right, that's going to really, really affect this relationship. So I think that's currently I can think of that one as being the biggest one. Other possible confounders, right? Again, when we're thinking about confounders, let's see, maybe I need to open up PowerPoint here just so I can draw this nicely. Let's see here. Get this out of here. See, folks, this is the nuts and bolts of doing research, is trying to think through this on the fly and see my thought process happening in real time. Here we've got our IV. I keep making this really wordy. Incumbent copartisanship. There we go. That's a little bit easier. So that's my IV. Now what do I have? A DV, obviously. Being concern over public health crises. Just say crisis. We don't know yet what the sort of case is going to be, right? We're talking about this in generality. When we get into the process of actually finding workable data where we'll be able to do this, we're going to make this a little bit more careful. We'll be able to say what the public health crisis actually is. I would love for it to be the COVID thing, but I don't think that there's going to be enough data yet for us to do it, right? It's too current. But sorry, my cat is nudging my mouse and causing me to misclick. Anyway, we've got this relationship here. Boom. IV to DV. Also the cat, not someone logging on to WebEx. Stop. Gosh, she's got so much fur. Okay, but then we've got this potential confounder here that we want to think about just in this like space. So I'm going to turn this bubble, well, say that, right? So now we have another thing, which is presidential queuing, right? And so the thing about presidential queuing is that, does that queue cause you to change your partisanship? I mean, like maybe on the absolute extreme margins, but I don't really think that that's going to have a major impact on the independent variable. That's not going to have an impact here, right? But it is potentially, where's my shapes? It is potentially going to have an effect on your concern, right? The presence of a queue here. Now, is there a link here? Does the independent variable of incumbent copartisanship affect whether or not there's presidential queuing? Well, we have to think about this from the perspective not of whether the president says something, but of whether or not the president, this presidential message is received, perhaps, right? So that's going to be the big thing. Does an individual, right? We're thinking about the level of analysis here. Does the individual receive presidential queuing? Does that have an effect on whether or not you become an incumbent copartisan? Again, maybe like at the extreme margins, but probably not. Instead, I think it's going to more work like this, right? Your incumbent copartisanship is going to affect whether you receive this, and it's also going to affect your concern over the public health crisis. And so that is really the sort of this kind of moderating effect here, where presidential queuing could have the potential to really, really increase your concern. And in fact, even more, it might even be more effective if you're the one who receives the presidential queuing, because you care about, you listen to the co-partisan president. And so this ultimately is a potential problem. It's something that we want to really think about as as something that's modifying our relationship. It's not something that goes inside the black box here, because it's changing the nature of the relationship. It's changing the direction. Right? This becomes sort of like a null if it's present. Like this thing, like this path, like increases concern, whereas this thing might decrease concern. So the net effect could be like nothing. So as a result, a definite confounder that we want to include here, at least the one that I've thought about thus far, is whether you get a cue from the president indicating that the crisis is severe. So maybe we could say receive. Because again, you might, the president might make a statement, but did you see the press conference yesterday at 5 o'clock? Like maybe not, and so it's not entirely clear. So yeah, we're rocking along here. We got kind of an outline that's more or less in line with our work on composition 4. What's really come down to is actually writing this out soon. I'm not quite in the position to do that yet, though, and that's because I really still have not yet fleshed out this lit review in a way that's particularly convincing, right? For one thing, I don't have any kind of statement yet about my gap. And part of that's because I haven't read everything in my golden bucket. I know some things about the golden bucket already. Again, that's based on my intuitions and my having read much of the literature on partisan misperceptions before. But again, I wanted to do something in this project that's like, the DV is something that I don't know much about, so that I could kind of put myself more or less in your shoes instead of in my shoes. And so I don't know. I don't know about this bucket. I don't know how full it is. I don't know if I'm able to make a statement yet really at all that's going to advance the literature. There's another reason why. I'm going to put this in here. IDK, bro. And that's because there's a couple of reasons. One, I haven't read the literature fully yet. Or I haven't read or searched, really. Secondly, what about our data, right? I haven't yet specified data or variables that that allow me to really say what specific case I'm actually looking at, right? Like, can I find data sets on SARS, on some of these other, on Zika, on mad cow, right? Like these could be historical data sets even that I'll search for in the data set archives. I don't know yet what the details are of my operationalization of my actual method. And so again, this is where we're still in the conceptual world here. We haven't yet really drilled down yet into the variable world. And that's going to be the next set. Beyond theory, it's going to be actually data. And that is going to be something that is for composition 5. Right? Here we go. Something that I'll have to specify soon. But for now, again, since the gap is not fully specified, I can maybe make some general statements yet currently about the gap. But that's going to happen largely after I have done this, right? I'll be able to at least say, no study has yet done this, right? They haven't really looked at partisanship from the perspective of a viral health outbreak, crisis, etc., in the contemporary period. So I can guess at my gap right now, but it's probably going to change. And that's, again, I think a really important lesson for any of you who are trying to make a great ultra online Poly 301 research project, is that even as you get into the data stage, a lot of this stuff could change. And in fact, I'm fully anticipating that what I've written down here, this is going to get substantially reformulated as I go. So, okay, so this live stream today, I was just really trying to show you the first steps and where I'm stuck currently in sort of devising a research project. And in the next live stream, which I'll probably maybe hit you up with that tomorrow, I'll just kind of go into the lit review. I will leave this project completely alone until I live stream again, so you'll be able to sort of follow along with me. And we'll start trying to work through this literature. We'll try to diagnose whether or not it's good or bad, or what we want, or if there's other stuff in my search that's going to lead me to want to include it. And then we'll start writing up the actual lit review. So, this has been a little bit under an hour, I think, right? Which is pretty cool. I think we're actually going to end up getting through most of the writing of the Lit Review and the introduction tomorrow, probably in about another hour. So yeah, that's all for now. I hope that you have found this useful, and if you're watching this asynchronously, that is not while I'm streaming, come on back to the next one. I'll announce to the group maybe next time when I'm live again. But for now, I was basically just bored in office hours. Nobody was here, and I figured it might be beneficial to you to start sketching out my own research project, just so you can again get a feel, right, for the ways in which this is, as I've said a billion times, like building the airplane while you're flying it. The way that this is like a really hard thing to do without like a ton of experience. So have fun. Good luck. I'll be live streaming again, maybe tomorrow. Continue to work on this paper. Hey, maybe I'll present this at ERCAT, right? That'd be kind of fun. Anyway, I'll see you guys soon.